disasters and how we would be in a position to respond to questions being asked about them. So first of all, let us pray. I welcome everyone, all who usually join us at this time for our health lecture, and all who are joining us on further and special invitation to our panel discussion of this annual health focus, True for the Final Generation Adventist Congregation. So I want to welcome all of you from wherever you are joining us. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for this privilege of sharing on various dimensions of health and well-being, and this afternoon focusing on mitigating multinational disasters in the Caribbean, and in fact, by extension, globally. Be with us, be with the panelists, guide and direct in everything. And we pray to you in the name of Jesus, thanking you for your mercy and protection. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, my preface remarks are simple. As Bible-believing Seventh Adventist Christians, we ought to be well aware of both the biblical history and biblical prophecy of natural disasters, as well as having some knowledge of the secular history of these natural disasters. We believe from the Word of God that the first natural disaster recorded in the Bible, though overlooked by many secular historians, was the record of the flood in Noah's day. Thereafter, natural disasters have increased in frequency down through history. In the days of Israel, for example, there are examples of natural disasters recorded of such severity that women actually cooked and ate their children. If we heard that nowadays, we would be astounded. But this is recorded in Bible history. And of course, Jesus himself in Matthew 24:7 predicted that there would be famines and earthquakes and wars and the waves of the sea roaring and men's hearts failing them to find solutions to these problems. And we know, for example, from Bible prophecy, we have the 1755 Lisbon earthquake as the opening of the sixth seal in Revelation 6:12, the opening of the sixth seal. So as believers, as Adventists familiar with Bible history and Bible prophecy, we are familiar with the biblical and therefore also to some extent secular record of disasters. And of course, in Revelation 16, there is the prophetic record written down that there will be such a massive earthquake and hailstones falling to end history that even experts who don't believe in the Bible or the book of Revelation use the term apocalyptic when describing severe global disasters. What a thing, they use the term, it comes from the Bible, apocalyptic, and what to God that they would believe the term they use, that it is of scriptural origin. One other point I would mention here before we get going, we believe and we know that disasters are the working of the cause and effect principles within the sin problem in a sinful fallen world. And as human beings depart farther and farther from God's righteousness and his gospel, then the Spirit of God working through the angels to hold in check the forces of evil, that check is pushed away, and the Bible predicts increasing disasters because of sin, not because of an angry God directly causing these things, but because God, as Paul mentions in Romans 1, lets go and gives up those who don't want him to the consequences of their choice. And these disasters, therefore, are the working of Satan's government. And my second last point is that as we approach the end, we know that Satan will manipulate these natural disasters to increase severity and also to deceive the world that a particular kind of plan must be put in place. We know it is the image and mark of the beast to solve these problems, and that will bring God's Sabbath-keeping believers into final focus and final trouble. My last point is this: right up until the closure of probation, because thereafter everything is really, as far as God's people are concerned, completely surrendered to God to work things out. But right up to the closure of probation, God's people must be prepared and equipped to safeguard their lives and to be able to give loving Christian service and help to anyone afflicted by any disaster. That's part of our Christian duty, to know about these things and to give loving Christian help to all those afflicted, to help safeguard our lives and the lives of others in these disasters. And therefore, this panel discussion focusing on multi-dimensional natural disasters in the Caribbean and by extension the world, we are focusing on, we have an overview, then we look at the impact of climate change as we run down to the end of this world's history, the legal implications, because that is going to be important as we see disasters occurring and governments have to do certain things, legality and civil issues come to play. And of course, then the psychosocial response and how that ties in with both believers and non-believers. So we have 4 well-qualified panelists in their respective presentation areas. And we are now ready to call on Dr. Karamita Douglin to give us, first of all, the overview of this topic, mitigating multinational natural disasters in the Caribbean region and by extension globally. Sister Karamita Douglin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Douglin. And I'm going to share my screen as I speak to you, noting that as a panelist, I only have 15 minutes. So therefore, each one of these areas would take like 2 hours. So I'm just giving a snapshot, basically. Okay, so as we heard, we're looking at multi-dimensional natural disasters in the Caribbean, and there are many disasters that affect our Caribbean region on an annual basis. There are some that affect some countries more than others, but natural disasters have caused significant harm. And disasters are not only cause loss of life, as we've seen, there's loss of property, but also psychological damage. And we've especially seen this with the COVID disaster. And poverty increases the impact of disasters, and developing countries tend to suffer more. Even recently with Hurricane Elsa, we saw that all the small shuttle houses, those were the ones that were impacted most. Those were the ones that were destroyed, and they led people further and further into poverty because they had to go to shelters, they had to go to relatives, you know, overcrowding. So that is the situation. So the impact of disasters can be mitigated by disaster preparedness and planning, and that is going to be my focus this evening. I'm going to be looking more at mitigation. So to be effective, disaster planning must involve everybody, each one of us, the church, the community, and the government. So towards the end of the 20th century, and you will hear more from Elder Greaves on this, we've seen an increase, especially in the Caribbean region. And then we've seen the pandemic that rocks the world. So what really is a hazard? And some people use interchangeably hazards and disasters, but they're actually two different things. So the hazard is the event that actually takes place, like the hurricane or the volcano or whatever. That is what a hazard is. So it is a natural or it could be man-made, but this evening we're going to be focusing on the natural, and it occurs with or without warning. Sometimes there's actually no warning, but sometimes we can put measures in place where we can warn people what is going to happen. Let's say a hurricane, we can give a warning for a hurricane. Sometimes it's very difficult to give a warning for an earthquake, but now the university can actually try to look at that and give warnings as well. And what is a disaster? Is an event which causes unacceptably large numbers of fatalities and or overwhelming property damage. So that's the definition of a disaster. A disaster is usually caused by a hazard. So can we do anything to prevent natural disasters? The answer could be yes, the answer could be no. But what we can do more so is to mitigate rather than to prevent, because a lot of these things you can't prevent, but the damage can be less if you do mitigation. And this here, I'm going to try to move these things so I can see better. So I'll just move them out of the way. Right. So what is disaster management? So disaster management can be defined as the effective organization, and you know how to organize things at home and wherever, direction and utilization of available counter or anti-disaster resources. And in the modern climate, is that there must be pre-disaster mitigation. And during the discussion period, I'm going to ask Brother Peter to speak just the one of those areas. And I'll mention it to you before. So pre-disaster measures to prevent or mitigate disasters are called risk management. And there's some areas here. This is a cyclic model, and I'm not going to go into detail of this model, but first there's the prevention. Then there's mitigation. Then you're prepared. You're given a warning, and then there's the disaster. After the disaster, then there's emergency response, rehabilitation, then reconstruction for all the loss of houses or whatever. And then the cycle goes on and goes on. So disaster risk management involves, as I mentioned, all persons, whether it's the government who put certain measures in place, non-governmental organizations, whether it's the church, whether it's the community, or whether it's you, the individual. And the disasters that we see most commonly in the Caribbean are hurricanes and floods. Those are the major disasters that we see in the Caribbean. But we also see earthquakes. Actually, Trinidad is in an earthquake zone. And then Haiti is also there with, as far as earthquakes are concerned. Volcanic outbreaks. And we have lots of Caribbean countries that have volcanoes. They're inactive, but yet we saw just earlier this year, the St. Vincent volcano La Soufrière was extremely active. And we never even thought that Barbados would have been impacted, at least not to the level that we were impacted. Okay, so volcanoes are very much with us in the Caribbean, and tsunamis. We can have tsunamis here as well. Landslides, caves, outbreaks, and food insecurity. I'm not going to touch on the landslides, so that's why I put the picture there so you can see. But here in Barbados, we do have landslides in the Scotland district, in St. Andrew. Every now and again, you see some houses totally shift from one place to another. So there are landslides. And we tend not to have food insecurity as much here, but after a major disaster, there is food insecurity, especially in terms of Haiti. We saw after the earthquake, persons were even baking mud cakes. You know, that was the level of food insecurity. So what is the earthquake? It's really a vibratory shaking of the ground caused by some sudden disturbance of natural origin within the earth. And if you look to the right, to my right, you're probably yours as well, yeah, there's some waves that takes place, but I'm not going to go into detail, otherwise I won't finish everything. And the vibrations are elastic waves traveling at high speed throughout the earth. And as you listen to climate change, I'm sure that this will become even clearer to you. Now, what can we do during an earthquake? And I'm going to, as I show you this light video, I'm going to talk to you about that. So direct hazards. You can have collapse of structures, as you can see there. There will be also falling debris. All right. Transportation issues. There can be floods as a result. And then they're indirect. You can have fires, you can have electrocution, and you can have exacerbation of chronic illnesses because persons can't get to the hospital, etc. So during an earthquake, you need to protect your head and face. You need to remain calm. People like to panic too much, so you need to remain calm. Otherwise, you can't think straight. Do not rush to the exits. If you're inside, stay inside. If you're outside, stay outside. And you need to move away from things that you need to do to mitigate your injuries. And what do we do after an earthquake? So after earthquake, there's some do's and don'ts. You can make checks, yes, but you have to realize and you have to be prepared that there will be additional earthquake shocks. So you might have one major shock, and then if you try to go into the earthquake zone or the area, then you might have another shock that would put you more at risk. You have to collect water, clear up hazardous material, turn on the transistor radio for emergency bulletins. And this tend to be the same for most of the disasters you would find. And stay away from potentially dangerous areas. The don'ts are: do not light a match or turn on a light switch. Never touch fallen power lines. And we saw this even here with Elsa. Persons were actually warned not to touch power lines. Do not use telephone except in extreme emergency. And if you have to use it in emergency, don't put it to your ears. Do not attempt to move seriously injured persons unless they are in further danger of injury. So otherwise you can make matters worse for that individual. So Haiti, we saw the earthquake in 2010 with a magnitude of 7 and a depth of 8.1 miles. Now, with an earthquake like that, really and truly, all you can do is mitigate by moving away from the area. There's a much more that Haiti could have done at that particular time, because remember, this is a natural disaster and not a man-made disaster. And it also had a localized tsunami, and there were 360,000 deaths, and that's the ones that were counted. Obviously, there were some that probably weren't counted. And in terms of displacement, over 1 million persons. So you can see the shanty town there with the tents that remained for years. That type of displacement that we saw in Haiti. Now, talking about volcanoes. Remember, I'm just touching briefly on some of these areas in the interest of time. The term volcano signifies a mountain or a hill with an opening or a vent from which gaseous, liquid, or solid materials from the Earth's interior are ejected. Now, the center of the Earth is extremely hot. So when you have a mountain with an opening, some things take place that tend to push, and then there's an explosion. All right. So that is what happened with the volcanoes. So before, there's a demarcation and evacuation of areas of risk. You would have heard all over the news the red zone, the orange zone. So in other words, you have a demarcation of the possible risk and the area that would be marked off that you should not enter. So the red zone is the immediate area around the volcano, while the orange zone is a little further out. So formulation of search and rescue plans. And we even saw that here in Barbados when we had a cave-in. We called and got persons qualified in the area from Florida to come in and help us. All right. So I am sure that St. Vincent would have had persons on standby for search and rescue, but fortunately, there was no lives lost from that volcano. So then there's preparation of hospital emergency plans. You always have to make sure that you have emergency plans in place in case there are burns, in case there's lung damage and trauma. You have to have all the emergency staff on standby. And identification of facilities to collect and analyze ash for toxic elements and to have drinking water quality. You would have heard that persons were told not to drink water in certain areas and to use bottled water. So all of that is taken into account. And then the facilities and equipment for monitoring air and plans for procurement of emergency supplies. From the time you know that you're going to have an eruption, all of these plans must be put in place. You have to report any and all unusual physical changes around the volcanoes. Unfortunately, in the region, we had the University of the West Indies there ready and monitoring on a regular basis. So we looked at before the eruption. So during the eruption now, what happens? You need to pay attention to all of the media and the warning signs. Some people like to think, oh, this is something exciting, I need to see what's going on. But you have to be very careful. So you need to listen to the radio, you need to follow. If you are asked to evacuate, you should evacuate. And you need to find shelter, but not in a building with a low pitch or flat roof. And that is mentioned throughout a lot of the mitigation because people like to build houses with flat roofs. And is not really the best thing either for volcanoes or for hurricanes, as you will find out. And you need to wear protective clothing. And our masks really came in to effect. We had masks for Corona, for the COVID-19, but when we wore those masks to just clean up the ash, it made a big difference. So we were happy to have those masks to use at the time. So always carry a flashlight. So you must be prepared during the daytime because it got really dark. When we had all the ash, and we were not in St. Vincent, we were in Barbados. And when you looked outside, it was very, very dark. It looked as though it was almost 8 o'clock at night. And it was like 2 o'clock during the day. So you have to make sure that you're well prepared. And in terms of mitigation measures, establish permanent danger zones, 4 to 6 kilometer radius, and educate the population. I remember Sister Christine saying to me when she lived in Montserrat that she was very knowledgeable of volcanoes because they kept educating the public all the time. Now, in terms of tsunamis, fortunately, in Barbados and in the region, we don't really get a lot of tsunamis, but the potential is there. There is Grenada kicking Jenny, and anytime that volcano, that is an underwater volcano, anytime that explodes, it will definitely be a tsunami and it will cover many countries. So we need to understand about tsunamis as well and be prepared. So the last major tsunami to strike the Caribbean was in 1946 after a magnitude of 8.1 earthquake struck the Dominican Republic, and that's right next to Haiti. And the earthquakes in the Caribbean often occur along faults. Remember, I spoke about the plates, where the North American and the Caribbean plates meet, you get earthquakes and then you can get tsunamis. And then again, there was one back in November 18th, 1867, an earthquake generated a tsunami and it may have killed up to 20 people. And this was close to Grenada and the Virgin Islands. So what are some of the do's? If a tsunami warning is issued, never go down to the beach to watch the waves. You know, even in floods and hurricanes, some people like to act dangerously. They like to go and see the high waves coming up, but you should never do that. Remember that a tsunami is a series of waves, and the first wave is not necessarily the biggest. So the first wave might be 10 feet, but then the next wave might be 25 feet and 100 feet and much higher. So, and that is moving faster than you. So don't take the chance of going to sea and I want a once in a lifetime experience, etc. No way. So you need to stay out of danger until an all clear is issued by the right authorities, not by you. Okay, so now we're talking about hurricanes. The 5 most destructive hurricanes in recent times were Dorian, August 24 to September 10th. In 2019, we saw lots of destruction. Maria, September 16 to October, that was 2017 as well. Something was wrong with 2017. And then there was Irma. So Maria and Irma were almost together. And then there was Harvey, and then there was Sandy. And we saw destruction after destruction throughout the Caribbean, especially Barbuda was actually no more. That was totally wiped off the map. Dominica, when I went back to Dominica recently, they still hadn't fully recovered from that massive hurricane. And there was just one major hotel, because a lot of hotels were actually destroyed. So, and there were poles down, everything that you can think about. But what about the economic impact? Now, I will leave Carl J to speak a little more on this, but if you have your entire house destroyed, you know, you got to pick it up and go again. Some people would have lost jobs. That is the difficulty. But when you have natural disasters, whether it is a disaster from COVID, a disaster from a hurricane, a disaster from a volcano, there's always an economic impact. And the economic impact is not only at you as an individual, but it's also at the government side. So that is where the difficulty comes, because you might expect the government to do a lot, but then the government has to do a lot for a lot of persons. And then the government also has limited funds as well. So this is an issue that we can discuss later, the whole economic impact. All right, so we need to identify hazards, assess vulnerability. We need to rehearse the simulation exercises. I don't really see much rehearsal now, but I remember when we were at school, we used to have some drills, but every now and again, you would probably see the Defense Force doing a simulation exercise. And some of the younger people might be totally lost. What are we going to do? You need to have plans. You must describe the activities. So each family needs to have a plan, a disaster management plan. If you know that your country has earthquakes, then you need to put mitigation in there for earthquakes. If you know it is just hurricanes and floods, then you have to have mitigation for that. All right. So all organizations and institutions and businesses and residences should have a plan. So if you don't have a plan, now we're in the hurricane season, it is a good time to have a plan. And in that plan, you also need to have that you have some type of plastic mechanism where you put your important documents in. That is critical. Even the plan itself should be kept within that secure, waterproof package. So you need to plan, must describe the procedures, what you're going to do, where is my nearest shelter in case I have to go, how soon are we going to go to this shelter? All of these things you need to have in your plan, the activities to be executed step by step. Now, this is what a hurricane looks like, and I'm sure that most of you would know how a hurricane looks and the dangers that these hurricanes can cause. All right, so what do we do at the household level? And a lot of persons ignore this until the day before the hurricane. And then we see the supermarket lines long, 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 long. So really and truly, this is something that you should have on like now. You shouldn't be waiting until you hear that, you know, there might be a hurricane or something is going to happen. You should have these. So you need to stock up on non-perishable foods. Doesn't make sense. And with our last hurricane, I mean, it was a storm most of the time, and then it was a category 1 hurricane Elsa. Persons spoke about losing lots of meat and losing all these different things, you know, and they knew that this was happening because we were getting some warnings from time to time. So it is non-perishable foods that you stock up on. Make sure that you have your medications if you need to get some additional ice and put it in a cooler. But as long as outside is cool, you probably don't need all of that, right? And then you need to have your drinking water. So you need to have not only drinking water, but some water put aside for bathing, for cooking, doing other things. So you need to make sure that you catch your water and you have water stored. If you have a water tank, so much better. But most people don't have water tanks, so make sure that you have your water. Then you have your communication. There's a radio there, there's batteries. Don't do like me, because I actually bought a radio and I bought batteries, but then when the hurricane came, the batteries could not fit the radio. So I had a nice little joke, but my neighbor, she had bought the same radio and she bought extra batteries, so we were able to get some from her. All right, so that's just an inside joke. And make sure you have a torchlight, and again, have batteries that can fit the torchlight. Have your cell phone and have it ready charged. And you see some insurance there, and make sure your house is insured and the things in your house as well are insured, because people have some very expensive stuff in the house, and if you don't have the things inside of the house insured, then you can lose those as well as the house. And if you could afford a generator, have a generator, because even if the electricity don't automatically go off, it will be turned off. All right. So just make sure that you have your generator hooked up and ready to roll. And then have your emergency packets that are waterproof that you can put your important documents in. So before, don't wait to the last minute to be searching for the documents. Make sure that you have them all. Like now, you should have, whether it is birth certificates, whether it is the same house insurance, you know, whether it is the property, whatever, you know, have all these and put them in some waterproof buckets that you can store them. And then there's also the making sure that all the family are included in the plan and they know what is happening. Suppose you were to get separated from your children, the children should know what to do. They should also know where the nearest shelter is. They should know who to contact, what numbers to use to contact. They should know that. Make sure that you trim your trees. Now, I would have shared a video of my mango tree, which is extremely tall, swinging and swinging. But I wanted to get it trimmed, but we couldn't get it trimmed in time. So it will happen at some stage. But make sure that if you have any branches overhanging, make sure that they are trimmed. All right. Clean your gutters. That is also important. And as much as possible, make sure that you lock down your roof. And notice the roof in this picture is not a flat top. When we talking mitigation, we also talking about building codes. And this is what during the discussion, Brother Peter Broom can mention to us what building codes really exist in Barbados or in Trinidad or in the Caribbean, that is that you know that you need to adhere to. All right. And then you can also, if you have a lot of glass windows, glass doors, etc., if you own businesses, make sure that you bolt up. You can get some plywood and make sure that you do some bolting up. So this is for hurricanes. But after the disaster, and in this case, the hurricane, you have to wait until the all clear is given. Too often we see people rushing out and the hurricane ain't even finished and they're on top of the roof trying to do things. That is dangerous. And you're putting other people in danger when they have to respond to that situation. So you check for the injured and dead persons after the disaster when the all clear is given, whether it is a volcano, whether it is a earthquake, whether it is a hurricane. You check on your livestock and your property, and you assist with help wherever you can. You can assist your neighbors. And the last one I'm going to touch on is the microbiological hazards. Now, these are also natural disasters, and these cause a lot of death. Actually, the death toll from microbiological hazards is far greater than from the other hazards that I would have mentioned before. Before, you might get more loss of property, and in these biological hazards, or pandemics, as we would see some of them, there's lots of loss of life. Okay, so we would have had in the past lots of them like smallpox and Spanish flu, you know, even HIV and TB and cholera. I remember hearing horror stories about cholera in Barbados and people burying people alive and all types of craziness. All right, but now we have another pandemic. We have the coronavirus. And a lot of these microbiological hazards might come from climate change too. We don't know if Elder Greaves will mention that, but a lot of them come from human beings destroying natural habitats or eating what they're supposed to eat, you know, and shifting everything. So you know how human beings like to do things and think that they're in control of everything and do the wrong thing and then cause issues over time. So my last slide is in terms of how can you mitigate this natural disaster, these microbiological hazards. And there are lots of protocols that all Caribbean countries have put in place in terms of mask wearing, in terms of cleaning, in terms of hand washing, in terms of distancing yourself, and vaccines. I know we have a lot of anti-vaxxers, people who figure they should not be using vaccines, but throughout the history of pandemics, microbiological hazards, we saw that vaccines played an extremely important role in terms of minimizing the impact and also getting rid almost completely of the particular microbiological hazard. Now, if it is viral, definitely you need a vaccine. If it is bacterial, then you can get an antibiotic and that will help. All right, because antibiotics do not act against viruses. I just want to repeat that. So therefore, you would need to get a vaccine. And if you figure, well, are you not getting any vaccine, then you're putting yourself more and more at risk. And we're not saying that the vaccine means that you will not get the virus, and don't misunderstand the scientists and what they're saying. You can get a vaccine and you can still get the virus. I work with COVID and I'm seeing that some fully vaccinated people are still coming down positive, right? But what we're saying is that it minimizes your risk of dying and of getting very ill. So that is important to note. And especially when you have all of these different variants. And now with this Delta variant, the Delta variant is extremely virulent. So we're seeing symptoms like diarrhea, still runny nose, long-lasting headache, sore throat, vomiting, which we weren't seeing before, aching muscles, tired, and feeling unwell. And we're seeing the Delta variant in a lot of younger people. It is not targeting the older people like the initial variants, but younger people are still getting very sick with this Delta variant. All right, so I'm going to stop there, and then you can ask any questions as we go along. I would allow the moderator, but I just wanted to give you this overview of these natural disasters that we will encounter. And my last slide, Caribbean countries are vulnerable to disasters and we need to be better prepared. This is my take home point to you. The importance of proper management of insurance claims, including honoring claims in a timely manner. Multi-hazardous maps are needed. Now, if you know you live in Trinidad, then you need to map out your earthquake zone. All right, if you live in St. Vincent, you need to make sure included in your map is your volcanic area. So building codes must be created, published, and legislated by government and adopted by you, by all of us. And then you have emergency communication is critical. So if the country can do it, then they have to appeal to like the University of the West Indies or seek help elsewhere. Please don't write on my screen. Regional response mechanisms must be strengthened. Now, we live in a very, I should say, all of our Caribbean countries are small. So we need to have a regional response in order to speak better. All right. So if we try to do it alone, it's not going to work. Building capacity. We need to build capacity for response teams, whether it's healthcare. We had to build a lot of capacity with the COVID-19. We actually had to bring persons in from Cuba and do some more training, brought persons in from Africa. So we had to build a lot of capacity. And then following instructions and protocols, including vaccinations. I know sometimes as individuals, we tend to think that, you know, God would just cure everything and we don't need to follow any other instructions. But as Dr. Douglin said at the start, we still need to follow the instruction of the land as we follow God's instructions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Carmita Douglin, for your presentation on giving a global, Caribbean overview of disasters. I think we will move on. We'll keep our questions for the end. When every presentation has been made, we'll have a session then for question and answer. So we're going to move on next to Elder W. Austin Greaves, who is also a public health, a retired public health master's in public health and expert and lecturer. And he did some special work and special emphases and actually had responsibility in the ministry for climate change. So Elder W. Austin Greaves, the impact of climate change on disasters, and especially as we approach the end. Elder Greaves, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Douglin. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be sharing my screen, but that's not what I want. Okay. Now, Sister Douglin gave a strong overview, but Dr. Douglin gave a tremendous opening, and I have approached it in that way. So I'll be looking at the climate change and part of the multidimensional natural disasters or multidimensional natural disasters. And of course, like everything else, we start at the very basic of definitions. And I quote here now from Life Science of November 3, 2020, what they refer to as climate change. And by the way, climate change is now being called climate crisis, a climate crisis. They are elevating it from just what they were regularly calling it because of what is being seen. And you would know, you could bear in mind, just last week, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium cried out on the floods that they had. This week, we had it in China. And then there are several other issues. And the Caribbean, of course, we will focus on that directly. So I'm going from global to local, but from ancient global to current local. Interesting perspective there. So I'm saying to you that this time, Life Science defines climate change as any long-term alteration in average weather patterns. I want you to keep that in mind very carefully. Any long-term alteration in average weather patterns, either globally or regionally. But the point I want you to hold is long-term alterations in the weather patterns, the average weather patterns. And they further say, as this broad definition suggests, climate change has occurred many times in Earth's history. And that is where Dr. Douglin referred to. I really want to pick it up from and go forward. Now, but first, weather. Because once we're dealing with climate, of necessity, you have to mention the word weather. Now, it refers to the short-term atmospheric condition at specific places, really. But climate is also the weather of a specific region, averaged over a long period of time. So that is just like what we said in the very first statement, any long-term alteration, average weather patterns. So we want to keep that in mind because it's going to focus very clearly. Then, as it relates to climate change, I'm going to show this thought here, but I will elaborate further. Now, it is caused by greenhouse gases. Everybody has heard a lot about greenhouse gases, but these are gases with at least with 2 or more atoms in one molecule. You know what is an atom? It's the most divisible particle. And a molecule, of course, is made up of all these atoms. And therefore, any gas that has 3 or more atoms in a molecule is classified as a greenhouse gas. And therefore, this is one of the gases that will cause climate change. And you can imagine up front, a gas, even like the simple water vapor, H2O, is classified as a climate change issue, you know. It is not as impactful as some of the others, like carbon dioxide. Of course, we hear a lot about carbon this and carbon that. Of course, when it gets in the atmosphere, it combines with the oxygen, and you have that massive problem that it creates for climate change. But then, of course, methane emits 4, that has more than 3 molecules. And therefore, these are some of the major climate change or the greenhouse gases that impacts climate change. And we're going to see as we go on a little further. But I go here now to the first record of climate change, like Dr. Douglin suggested. And like I said to you, I want to bear in mind that climate change refers to long-term changes. Of course, the short changes will be just the weather. But the first instance of climate change is recorded in the Bible in Genesis. Very, very interesting. And people can take a note of these little texts. But in Genesis chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, I'm going to compare it with something to show you how it really stacks up with climate change. So in verses 2, 5, and 6, we have the statement, and every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, for the Lord had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. So there was no rain as yet, and we're going to see all of this. Then verse 6 here, but there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. So it means that if there's any change between that mist watering the ground, there would have been a change of weather and climate. But we're looking at the climate issue. And then if you were to look at Genesis chapter 7, I read verse 10 to 12, first of all. And it came to pass after 7 days that the floods of the waters were upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the deep broken up, and the windows of the heaven were opened. And then verse 12 says, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Now this is after the initial weather change that occurred when sin entered. And this was approximately over 1600 years afterwards, according to Bible reckoning, showing it was a long-term issue we're dealing with. Over time, this thing began gradually to develop, and then, of course, it struck down very hard. And then verse 17 to 20, and then 24, we're just looking at some ancient ideas of climate change. It says, and the flood was upon the earth, and the waters increased, and bare up the ark, and it was lifted up above the earth. And the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the earth, waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. And then verse 20, 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. And we're going to see why I'm emphasizing this. And then verse 24 says, and the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. Wow. So that after the creation, 1600 years after, a major catastrophic event occurred called the flood. But all along, the climate had been changing. Tremendous changes were recorded over that period of time. But we're going to go a little further. And this is one of the changes that even occurred just after. Now, in Genesis 10:25, and the article is quoted in 1 Chronicles 1:19, we have this statement. And unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg. For his days the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Now, this was approximately 200 years after the flood. Amazing. 200 years after the flood. And by the way, you can find this information in Genesis 11. And this was around the same time as Babel. A matter of fact, Nimrod is mentioned about the same time as Peleg. He was about the great-grandchild of Noah. And Peleg himself was a great because Peleg came from Shem and Nimrod came from the Ham line. So they're relatives in actual fact. Of course, the rebellious aspects and the one who were more congenial to the words of God. So all along, these things were happening. And of course, we hear that a man called Nimrod was a mighty hunter. That is, he was getting people against God. All of this time, he was setting up, he was building cities, he was doing all kinds of things. All right. Now, this is an interesting translation of the Hebrew text. It says, and to ever, that is, Eber, cross over his call, were brought forth 2 sons. The title of the one was Peleg, meaning half, given that his day the land was split. Wow. That has to be a major catastrophic event, a major climatic event, in actual fact, a climate change situation. And we are told by those who study the earth carefully that the earth was at one time a ball-worn place with the seas at the periphery. Unlike now how the seas and the various water bodies are between the land masses and so on and separating the land masses. So that this text is interesting and it gives a perspective of the fact that climate change, like they say in the very first statement, has been happening continually and is not now the first time. But we have biblical evidence, solid evidence to show us that we are probably, and not probably, I'm more definitive than that, we are at a time when the climate will be just as well, the catastrophic occurrence, just like what happened when the earth was, according to them, split. And the word is split, not just divided as to in tongues, but actually split. And people say you can actually put the land masses together and get it back into one land mass separate from the seas, which is very interesting. Something that we could look at, but I don't have the time for that. Now, I want now to look at something also, because I must bring a number of things together. I'm not going necessarily coherent in terms of sequence, but I'm sure you'll be able to get it together. I'm looking at what is referred to as the ozone layer. And here I call it the significance of the ozone layer and climate change. And I want to quote first of all Job 38:9, because we've come to realize that this has relevance to the ozone layer, that layer of gas that protects the earth from the ultraviolet radiation that comes from the sun. And when that layer of gas is breached, as it has been breached, especially over Antarctica, we have a lot of issues. Of course, the ultraviolet radiation coming in, creating real problems. Like, for example, simply, well, things like melting glaciers, or even skin cancers. But I will mention that just by the way. Now, Job 38:9 says, this is God speaking, because I asked you to come on, talk with me. Now, you talk a lot, talk with me. When I made a cloud, the garment thereof, and thick darkness, a swaddling band for it. He asked Job, where were you? Now, we've come to realize that this swaddling band is really a cloud of gases that surround the earth to protect it from the ultraviolet radiation. We call it the ozone layer because of the concentration of ozone in the area. But the ozone layer, or you should say, or the ozone shield, and that's what it is a shield, is a region of Earth's stratosphere. I'll just give you an illustration shortly, that absorbs most of the sun's ultraviolet radiation. That's what really ozone shield or layer is all about. If that layer is breached, which it has been, we're going to see something that is referred to in Revelation 16, and we will understand therefore then that God doesn't do anything arbitrarily, really. So all of that is going to be brought in. Now, I say here it contains a high concentration of ozone, O3, and is approximately 10 to 40 miles or 10 to 50 kilometers above the Earth's atmosphere. Now, just this week, you heard of Jeff Bezos going to the edge of space where there's weightlessness. Well, that meant he went just beyond the ozone layer, the stratosphere, because the Earth has different stratas, and where we are is called the troposphere. And then you have what they call a tropopause, and then above that, the stratosphere and the stratopause, and then the mesosphere, where we go into outer space, where it gets extremely cold. But what I'm saying then is, the ozone layer was placed there by God to protect this Earth from the damaging effects of ultraviolet radiation, which is serious. So that at the beginning, when God created the Earth, this layer of gas, or what Job called a swaddling band, surrounded the Earth, and it meant therefore then that the ultraviolet radiations, rather than penetrating, and because this was a gas layer, it was these ultraviolet were diffracted, and it came through very nicely, because the water vapor in the atmosphere did not allow that, and that gas, actually, the ozone, did not allow the ultraviolet radiation to come through and hurt Adam and Eve. So they had an air-conditioned paradise because of this ozone layer. And you tell me that God don't know what he's about? And therefore, human beings, as we call it, anthropogenic climate change, the impacts that human beings are having on the climate is the real cause of what we're seeing since with floods, earthquakes, and tsunamis and tornadoes. We're going to see that because the sun is the center of our solar planet. Any impact or effect on that particular body will affect us down here. And that's the reality. But let's go a little bit more further. This is an illustration of the strata of the Earth. Like I said, the stratosphere is from the Earth's surface to about 10 kilometers above the Earth, approximately. And then, of course, in that area, of course, I have the stratopause, sorry. We have the next area called the stratosphere, of which we're speaking about. And that is approximately 10 to 15 kilometers above the Earth, or 10 to 30 miles up. And you have heard I said this week that Jeff Bezos went to the edge of space. That meant he went past the stratopause because he went about 60 miles. As you will see, 40 miles is still above the stratopause into the mesosphere. So he would have gone up there. And you know, one of the things, I call it the brazen things he said, was that we must now put much of our infrastructure in outer space so that we can protect our Earth from the hazards that will occur. Boy, human beings are brazen in truth. So destroy the Earth, they figured out where to save it now, you must get the things off it. But they don't realize that when they put it in space, what will happen? Because water goes up, comes down. And we're going to see something interesting about that. So that climate change, therefore, then will has impacted us very negatively. We saw it from the time of Noah. And therefore, when you consider the layers of the Earth's atmosphere and the ozone layer, which was given by God to protect us and protect the Earth's atmosphere from these hazardous infrared rays from the sun, you will understand when we are saying certain things, it means then that the ozone layer, which you see in the middle of the stratosphere, around 30 kilometers or there, mentioned there, 20 miles up, has been affected. And that is why climate change is it has taken on so much significance because of what will happen as it gets worse. Now, I want to also track climate change from the Bible. I will use the Apostle Peter's statements to tie into where I want to go. Now, in 2 Peter 3:3-7, there's some thought. It said, in the last days, scoffers walking after their own lusts, and these are the days we're in, I believe, say, where is the promise of his coming? Listen to it. For since the fathers fell asleep, and I don't mean 2,000 years ago, we're talking about the time of Noah because that's the time of Peter speaking. All things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. That's what they're saying. So, you know, there's some, just like there are anti-vaxxers, anti-climate, or they're climate deniers. They're changing climate. And you know, a particular party, apparently the United States is head for that. There are changes in the climate. I want to hear something. Look around right now in North America and, of course, Western United States and Canada. What are you saying? The whole place is burning down. Not because anyone has lighted anything, but because the rays that are coming from the sun, not that the sun is even getting hotter, you know. The sun is getting hotter. You know what is happening? The layer of gas around the Earth is being eroded. And by the way, the scientists tell us that, especially in the last century, you would hear a lot of CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, those gases, for example, that we used to have, let's say, in say refrigerators. They had been liberated over years, and they began to destroy the ozone gases, the ozone layer, because they say that one CFC would destroy over 210 atoms of the ozone, 210 compared to 1. So it meant that over time now, the expanding destruction of the ozone layer has become probably beyond recall. And you will keep on hearing that they don't hope that the climate of the Earth does not go above 2.5 degrees Celsius. So that means that we'll discover something, that many of the cities of this Earth will be inundated and lost. They say that, for example, Miami, New York, will virtually disappear. But you want to hear something? You know, this is leading us to something very significant. In Revelation, we are told that islands will disappear. And we also say that popular cities will be decimated. I believe, brethren, while that might occur after probation closes, that we're going to see a lot more of it before probation closes, and we can trace it back to climate change. That is because the Earth's atmosphere now is heating up. As it heats up, the glaciers at the various poles, especially the Arctic region, what is happening? They're melting. Greenland is now becoming a Greenland, not now Iceland. Iceland itself is losing mass in terms of, well, not so much mass, but it's covering, that is the permafrost, as you call it. The ice is melting. And, you know, we down here in the Caribbean, as we go towards that, are not accepted. You know what they tell us? That is a particular glacier that if it breaks off completely, we will be affected in the Caribbean. How? Coastal flooding will occur. And I will speak to that in a little while. Now, also going to verse 3 here in 2 Peter, it says, in the last days, like I said, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. But he goes on to say, they willingly are ignorant, watch it, that by the word of God, the heavens were of old and the earth standing out of water, the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was being overflowed with water perished. So the change of the earth, Peter is recounting the climate caused the entire world to perish. I don't think that God was out there throwing down water. This was because of what happened at the flood. And what really caused it, it meant that the sun was impacted, we are told, it cooled down. And once that happened, in actual fact, it means therefore then that water began to come down, the deeps were broken up. An entire flood we read in Genesis just now occurred. Serious thing, you know. So that climate change impacts significantly. But look at verse 7, but the heavens and the earth, which have now by the same word are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. No more water this time, but fire. How come fire? If you understand the vast reserves of coal as a result of the buried at the flood, the buried trees and massive forests and even humans that were buried now are gas forming in themselves, really. That's what really happened there. Because they are, like we say, you know, they contain the oxygen, the carbon, the hydrogen. It means therefore then that oils are there produced. And that is why certain parts of the world has much more oil than other parts. And it seems to be those parts that were more inhabited have, of course, more of the impacts of what occurred at the flood. So that massive forests were buried. And as a result, the organic material began to, of course, conversion towards the oil, etc. But I go to Isaiah 36:26 to make this point as it continues now. He says, moreover, the light of the moon shall be the light of the sun, and the light of the sun shall be sevenfold, as the light of 7 days, in the day that the Lord bindeth up the breach of his people, and healeth the stroke of their wrong. That is to say, it appears to me, when God finishes, when everything on earth is completely destroyed, God will restore to its original pristine glory the earth. And therefore, the sun, the moon now will have its own light in actual fact. Will be as the light of the sun. And the sun itself is sevenfold. So that it means that because of the flood, it appears to me, there has been the cooling off. And as a result, the flood waters came down. But when now these massive forests and all of what was buried, there's now going to be fires that will cause destruction. And we will see that also as you look at Revelation 16. Now, let me go a little further quickly to natural disaster because I have had 15 minutes, but look as though the following is a calamities is on for a sec, but no problem. Now, natural disasters, I say here, are major adverse events resulting from the natural processes of the earth. The examples she gave nicely: hurricanes, tornadoes, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, storms, sea level rise, and other geologic processes. And all these stem from warming temperatures, which is the common factor in all these natural disasters, every one of them. And just to bring certain things together, we talk about tsunamis, sea level rise, etc. But you know, we can have a lot of coastal erosion as a result too of the runoff from a result of storms and hurricanes. And we're going to have some serious problems with our potable drinking water. Because when floods occur, the sewage wells and the sewers are affected, and the water for drinking is impacted, meaning then that we can have a lot of biological issues, both by bacterial and viral illnesses resulting. So that what I want to say is climate change will exacerbate all of these disasters, bad as they are. You can consider, like I said earlier, what happened in China, what is happening in North America, what is happening in Europe, and of course, Africa with its problems, and Asia. They're all, and if you were to take a study of Australia, for example, many people probably don't realize it, but Australia itself is in a mess when it comes to increasing temperatures. And you realize that temperatures in several places in the United States and throughout the world are now cresting above normal record periods. And they're all saying climate change has a responsibility for it. And I say yes, it's because the earth has been affected by human beings and their dealings with the destruction of the ozone layer and what has been going up there for so many years. And as a result, the ozone layer cannot bear those insults continually. So we're going to see more and more of those situations. But in the Caribbean, the multi-dimensional natural disasters which will be impacted by climate change are hurricanes. And we are told something very interesting by the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology. They say that Jamaica in the west, Barbados in the east, and Trinidad in the south will experience significant impacts as a result of this issue dealing with climate change. They say that Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad will experience lesser rainfall, but it will occur in heavy amounts, but lesser rainfall is occurring, which means then that it is going to be a lot of erosion. And we are saying that already, you know. You realize that the rain is not falling as much, but when it does fall, it comes down in torrents, creating floods. So their projection was very clear, and that was a couple of years ago. So that the hurricanes are going to increase, and now we're being told that because of climate change, you don't get another one hurricane for joy. You know, you realize that the hurricanes in the Caribbean Basin and the Atlantic has been ramping up between 3 and 5. We were forced to get a little one in this region recently. You know, it probably is to remind people, you know what, you guys wanted a little idea of a hurricane, but take this and see what you can bear. But it tells us that if a 3 or 4 hurricanes come around here, we're going to be no different from Barbuda that Sister Carmita spoke about. And of course, Brother Peter is supposed to address this issue of the building code, the overhang for roofs, especially. This is one of the biggest problems, roofs and foundations. But I go a little further because I don't want to go too far into that. Sea level rise, and all of this will stem from, again, climate change causing the poles, the glaciers, and actually to melt. And when they melt, it is going to be catastrophic. We don't fully grasp it as yet, but there are many people who are beginning to experience it. There are countries like Bangladesh, for example, well, Bangladesh is virtually like Guyana, almost on the sea level, and they get lots of problems. And you will know the situation in Southeast Asia. Every now and again, you hear a lot of heavy hurricanes affecting them. We too will begin to see more and more intense hurricanes, and we too will be affected. And like Mrs. Douglin said, we have to mitigate for these things. But I want to go to the impacts of climate change on multi-dimensional, multidimensional disease that we're talking about. Now, I'm just going to do three of them. One, the impacts will be seen on the economy, and that is the first thing that was mentioned. They will destroy the tangible assets such as buildings and equipment. And if they are not insured, and then again, you know, they have the insurers have to reinsure. And it means that it's going to take a higher level of reinsurance for places in the Caribbean region to get compensation for their buildings and plants or the assets that were destroyed. So that is one region. And of course, the houses that she mentioned about. These are the kind of impacts we're going to see. And not only those, but we're going to see things like roads, destruction of bridges. And all because the climate is impacting more and more as the protection that God gave for the earth is being affected and disrupted. Then, of course, under the economy, the human capital, as a result, deterioration of the production capacity. So once your human capital is affected, you will have deterioration of the production capital. You're not going to be able to produce. People will be impacted, people will be affected, people will be made ill, all those kind of things. As a result, your GDP will fall on the ground virtually, because if you don't have people to work, to be employed, you know the kind of impacts that will occur. Then this one, I'm not going to speak to it much because I imagine about the always speak mental health issues, alcoholic misuse and abuse, domestic violence. And we're told that even during the COVID crisis, there was a significant increase in domestic violence, serious, and then alcohol abuse was terrible. And of course, you have chronic diseases and short-term unemployment. And these are things that will cause social unrest. And you see what happened in Cuba recently. You see what happened in China on some occasions, and some of the Asian countries. People are crying out, we can't bear any shutdown because we are starving, we're not getting food. And even over in North Korea, I'm told there is some foment going on there because people are affected. The social impacts are tremendous. But then I go to the environment, which is my baby. The destruction of buildings, the tearing up of roads, and the term of normal life. Wow, you can imagine, therefore, then how the impacts climate change will have on this kind of thing. Because all of the disasters will be fomented or exacerbated by climate change. Then you have erosion, the destruction of wildlife, water contamination, release of carbon dioxide. You know, we don't think about it much, but when you have hurricanes, I know lots of our infrastructures along the coastline, and that speaks to all of the Caribbean countries, so that all the Caribbean countries are at risk, in actual fact, for what we call the inundation. And of course, where we're going to look a little further a little bit at how the impacts of sea level rise and so on. You look at the Caribbean countries, look at for example, the airports in many Caribbean countries. You could think about St. Lucia, where VG is. Also down south, down in south of St. Lucia, you have the airport, vulnerable. You go to Jamaica, both airports, the Saint-Stan, Normandie airport, vulnerable. You go to Dominica, the same thing occurring. So that with the advent of climate change exacerbating these type of problems, normal life will be upturned. Also here in Barbados, we've done a vulnerability mapping of Barbados. I remember while working, I will notice that from St. Lucie, just the well, the periphery of St. Lucie on the west, because on the east is a problem there as well. All along St. Peter, Schweigstown, where Brother Broom and those guys and Brother Kellman live, these are classified as most vulnerable because they are 2 kilometers in away from the sea, within 2 kilometers from the sea coast. And therefore, if you have a tsunami or a heavy a category 5 hurricane, and you have water coming in, it's going to rush all up there at least 2 kilometers in. It means we are vulnerable, and climate change will layer on to this and cause more and more problems. And of course, contamination of water, like I mentioned, then the ecological effects, now accept the relationship between the organisms, and of course, including human beings and the environment. So that really, climate change, therefore, then is an existential threat, as we would say, to our life itself. As I wind down, I mentioned here storm surges, they also release toxic chemicals. Gas stations, if they're flooded, what do you think would happen? If Leighton Power, where is located on Spring Garden, if that was to be impacted with a tsunami, what do you think would happen? There are a lot of toxic chemicals in these places, you know. And therefore, if it gets into the water system, the potable water system, there will be disruption. And you can understand, therefore, then how we be negatively affected. But quickly now, I just want to give you some stats. Because I mean, there's so much more on climate change that I could really talk about, but of course, time is crucial. Now, the natural hazard in Caribbean is said there are 2, this is from the World Bank, from the Inter-American Development Bank. There are 2 costly to ignore. They said that for the period 1990 to 2008, which is just a matter of 18 years, the Caribbean experienced 165 natural disasters. Listen now, the total impact, damage, and losses for this period estimated to be $136 billion US dollars, with the economic impact being the highest at 63 billion. Now you can imagine if we didn't have to look for the money to do repairs and restoration and so on, how that could feed into our health system, how it could feed into our educational system, and we could be more advanced. But you have to think of responding to these kind of hazards. And then further, between 1900 and 1980, matter of fact, it says estimated between 1980 and 2016, which is another 36 years, disasters triggered by natural hazards, and this is in the Caribbean, Latin America, caused approximately 400,000 deaths. We were talking about dislocation of human capital. We were talking about climate refugees, and that is something else that must be borne in mind. That can happen. It said it caused approximately 400,000 deaths and cost more than $180 billion in economic loss in real terms, almost quadruple that which was reported in previous 80 years. And you know what I say? Compare this 80 years with that 80 years, look at the climate change issue and layer onto this, it tells you climate change is impacting significantly. And of course, we have had the Mauna Loa monitoring station over in Hawaii that shows that the climate is changing, is getting hotter. As it gets hotter, we will be impacted. All of these hazards, all of these natural disasters will increase, will be exacerbated, and human beings' lives will be put at risk. And the last thing I want to mention then is from the Bible again. If you go into your Bible, which you know very well, Revelation chapter 16, you hear about the plagues. And I want to suggest to us, again, the plagues are not anything that God causes. The plagues are a result of human activity and behavior in this world. And look at the plagues carefully. If you look at, for example, when the angels broke their vials, for example, the first one we are told, a grievous sore upon men which are the mark of the beast. So these are people who curse God. So they're not shielded and protected as God would like to do all human beings. But a terrible sore occurred. So where would this sore have come from? All right, I go further first. Then the second angel, the sea became blood. like the blood of a dead man or blood of a man. What happens? And I'm suggesting human, what we call anthropogenic behaviors affecting the whole, well, the climate, the Earth's climate, is creating this kind of situations because there are some parts of the oceans right now, I'm told, that is virtually dead, many parts. And of course, from time to time, you hear about red tide, which of course is a different phenomenon altogether. But then look at, especially plague number 4. It deals with the first 8, sun-scorching men. Sun-scorching men. And I'm saying again, sun is not going to get any hotter right now. It will bound up eventually according to what we read earlier. But it is happening because the impacts of climate change on the ozone layer, eroding, destroying those, that protective gas that God put around the earth like a swaddling band to protect and take care of us. I thank you.
Well, we thank Elder Austin W. Greaves very much for that talk. We had 2 excellent presentations thus far, and he has showed us a lot of interconnections between what I call the theology and mechanisms of these disasters as we approach the end time, and we thank him very much. Well, now we move on to Sister Cara J. Thomas, attorney at law, very much Barbadian, but now lives in St. Lucia with her husband, and she's going to be talking about the legal implications of mitigating multidimensional national disasters in the Caribbean. Sister Cara J. Thomas, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, brothers and sisters.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay. As mentioned by Dr. Douglin, the moderator, my focus this afternoon will be on the legal implications of mitigating multidimensional disasters. Or perhaps we can put it this way, it might be more fitting, the legal considerations when mitigating multidimensional disasters in the Caribbean. Now, Sister Carmenta said that I will touch on the economic impact, but I do not claim to be, neither do I aspire to be an economist. So perhaps someone else who aspires to be such or who claims to be such can give their input when we are discussing. I will also try to be a little more brief than the persons who have gone before me, but I will not say too much because I know their intentions also were to be brief. So I will start like this and I will end similarly. Romans 14:5 says, let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. Ephesians 4:14 says that we henceforth be no more children tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the sleight of men and the cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive. Now, we in the Caribbean and in other parts of the world have experienced over the last year and in previous years various types of disasters which Sister Carmenta spoke about and also Brother Greaves. And during the period February, March of last year until presently, we have been struggling to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And then in April, we had the eruptions of La Soufrière volcano in St. Vincent. Very shortly before which the government, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines had issued a mandatory evacuation order for persons living in the red zone of the island of St. Vincent. That would be the northeast and northwest of that island. And then at the beginning of this month, we had Hurricane Elsa having an impact on Barbados and St. Lucia. And the Caribbean has been affected by several other hurricanes over the years, like Maria that was mentioned before, Ivan back in 2004, and Thomas, which you would probably all remember. But I believe the focus of most persons presently is health crises. And in particular, the health crisis that is a COVID-19 pandemic. It has captured our attention not only because of the seemingly swift way in which it shut down many countries and accounted for many deaths, hospitalizations, bed shortages, panic, and uncertainty, but now, especially this year, it has captured our attention because of the rollout of vaccination programs in several countries. Common concerns from persons are that the vaccine came about too quickly. Persons have adverse reactions from the vaccine, and there's uncertainty about the long-term side effects. I do not propose to get into these issues, as it is not my calling or prerogative to do so. However, I will look into some legal considerations as it relates to government seeking to mitigate the effects of disasters of all kinds, but more so, I will bring into sharp focus the COVID-19 pandemic and similar crises. As we have observed and experienced as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, governments have had to implement measures in their efforts to curb the spread of the virus. These measures include restrictions of movement, shutdown of business places, churches, educational institutions, and other institutions, stay-at-home orders, border closures, and so on. Consequently, some persons questioned whether their constitutional rights were and are being violated. Now, we as Christians should have some knowledge and understanding of our constitutional rights and our constitutions in general. And these are some of the fundamental rights of the individual enshrined in the constitutions of Commonwealth Caribbean countries. I will give snippets from different constitutions of different Commonwealth Caribbean countries as we go on, because we have similar provisions in the countries in this region. Okay, so the right to personal liberty. The Constitution of Barbados at section 31 says no person shall be deprived of his personal liberty, save as may be authorized by law in any of the following cases. That is to say, and they list several cases, and at point G they say, for the purpose of preventing the spread of an infectious or contagious disease. And there we have the justification for quarantining and isolation in the Constitution itself. Because we have persons who thought that in being subjected to quarantine, their personal liberty, their right to personal liberty was being violated. At section 13(5) of the Barbadian Constitution, again, we see that nothing contained in or done under the authority of any law shall be held to be inconsistent with or in contravention of the foregoing provisions of this section to the extent that the law in question authorizes the taking during a period of public emergency of measures that are reasonably justifiable for the purpose of dealing with the situation that exists during that period.
Somebody has their microphone unmuted and a lot of unnecessary noise is coming through. If you're not speaking and only one person is speaking right now, please mute your mics. Sister Karaja, continue, please.
Okay, so actually on my end, there is elections on Monday, so there's a truck driving in the area now that I have begun to speak with loud music. So it's probably my end as well, give a job. Just give me about a few seconds. Okay, so I was saying that nothing contained in or done under the authority of any law shall be held to be inconsistent with or in contravention of the foregoing provisions of this section to the extent that the law in question authorizes the taking during a period of public emergency of measures that are reasonably justifiable for the purpose of dealing with the situation that exists during that period of public emergency. So we have a clause there saying reasonably justifiable, and these terms are important for us as Christians and as Seventh-day Adventists. And then we see a similar provision in the Constitution of Jamaica at section 14(1). It says, no person shall be deprived of his liberty except on reasonable grounds and in accordance with fair procedures established by law in the following circumstances. And in this other circumstance, and it says at H, the detention of a person for the prevention of the spreading of an infectious or contagious disease constitution a serious threat to public health. And this would obviously apply to the COVID-19 situation. And we have similar provisions in the constitutions of St. Lucia and Grenada. So far that's Barbados, Jamaica, St. Lucia, and Grenada. And now freedom of conscience, the provision and the section as it applies to freedom of conscience, which is very applicable to all of us. Section 91 says, except with his own consent, no person shall be hindered in the enjoyment of his freedom of conscience. And for the purpose of this section, the said freedom includes freedom of thought and of religion, freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and both in public and in private, to manifest and propagate his religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. And section 19.6 says, nothing contained in or done under the authority of any law shall be held to be inconsistent with or in contravention of this section, to the extent that the law in question makes provision which is reasonably required, my emphasis, in the interest of defense, public safety, public order, public morality, or public health, my emphasis again. And I will return to the aspect of freedom of conscience before I close. Freedom of expression, and this is from the Grenadian Constitution, Article 10, subsection 1. Except with his own consent, no person shall be hindered in the enjoyment of his freedom of expression, including freedom to hold opinions without interference, freedom to receive ideas and information without interference, freedom to communicate ideas and information without interference, whether the communication be to the public generally or to any person or class of persons, and freedom from interference with his correspondence. So we know we had a lot of sharing of information, especially from the beginning of the pandemic, about how it came about and the spread and what is happening. Some of it true and some of it not true. Subsection 2 says, nothing contained in or done under the authority of any law shall be held to be inconsistent with or in contravention of this section, to the extent that the law in question makes provision that is reasonably required in the interest of defense, public safety, public order, public morality, or public health. And now we have freedom of movement. Section 22(1) of the Constitution of Barbados. No person shall be deprived of his freedom of movement, that is to say, the right to move freely throughout Barbados, the right to reside in any part of Barbados, the right to enter Barbados, the right to leave Barbados, and immunity from expulsion from Barbados. And we know we had another situation with persons with border closures and citizens. I know Trinidad is a case in point, where they closed their borders even to citizens. And I think only recently, perhaps this month, reopened them with some measures in place. So there were questions, there were concerns about leaving your citizens stranded on the outside in this situation. Now, what is unique about Trinidad is that they have a border issue because there are Venezuelans who access Trinidad illegally, which created a serious problem for them in their fight against COVID-19. So while their citizens were stranded elsewhere and suffering from several reports, there were persons who aren't citizens entering illegally. So there are a lot of political issues and other issues at play there. So that came up as a concern among us in the Caribbean, and I think in particular in Trinidad. We have at subsection 3, it says, nothing contained in or done under the authority of any law shall be held to be inconsistent with or in contravention of this section, to the extent that the law in question makes provision for the imposition of restrictions on the movement or residence within Barbados, or on the right to leave Barbados of persons generally or any class of persons that are reasonably required in the interest of defense, public safety, public order, public morality, or public health. And there was restrictions on internal movement as well. So you either had stay-at-home orders, or in the case of St. Lucia, at the beginning, there were zones where if you were from Anse-Soleil, Gros-Islet, Castries, you stayed in that zone. If you're from Dennery, Soufrière, Beaufort, Labrie, etc., you stay in that zone. So you could not cross these zones or restrictions, or you could not You could only go to the supermarket on some days here in Barbados and elsewhere. And therefore, there are restrictions on where you could go, when you could go, and if you could go at all. Now, just a general something from the Constitution of Jamaica, Section 13.2. Subject to sections 18 and 49 and to subsections 9 and 12 of this section, and save only as may be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society, Parliament shall pass no law, and no organ of the state shall take any action which abrogates, abridges, or infringes those rights. Now, we always see things like demonstrably justified or justifiable in a free and democratic society, reasonably required, reasonably justified, or justifiable. And we will therefore understand that reasonableness is what the governments have to take into consideration and what the courts will look at if any action is brought against the state, or as we will see against the state, against the government in a situation like this one, the COVID-19 pandemic. And then the case coming out of Barbados, which is instructive for us. The Court of Appeal of Barbados, it is Whelan, the Attorney General, and the Dental Council, 2009 case. The Court of Appeal of Barbados stated that 2 criteria must be satisfied to establish that a limit on a charter right is reasonable in a free and democratic society. First, the objective which the limit is designed to achieve must be of sufficient importance to warrant overriding a constitutionally protected right. So we see the first criteria. Secondly, if such an objective is established, the invoking party must show that the means chosen to achieve the object, that is the limit itself, is reasonable and demonstrably justified. And these are things that we have to remember and take into consideration, because we know that these same provisions will be thrown at us as we approach the mark of the beast crisis. So we have to be able to balance things. When is it reasonable? When is it not? When is it a breach? And when is it a lawful abrogation of a right? Exceptions for emergencies. And some of us would know that Trinidad is known for declaring states of emergencies or public emergencies. There are provisions for that in the Barbados Constitution and the other constitutions in the Caribbean region as well, in the Commonwealth Caribbean. Section 7.1 of that constitution says, without prejudice to the power of Parliament to make provision in the premise, but subject to this section, where any period of public emergency exists, the President may, due regard being had to the circumstances of any situation likely to arise or exist during such period, make regulations for the purpose of dealing with that situation, and issue orders and instructions for the purpose of the exercise of any powers conferred on him or any other person. And section 7, subsection 3 says, an act that is passed during a period of public emergency and is expressly declared to have effect only during that period, or any regulations made under subsection 1 shall have effect even though inconsistent with sections 4 and 5, except insofar as its provisions may be shown not to be reasonably justifiable for the for the purpose of dealing with the situation that exists during that period. And we see that term again, reasonably justifiable. Section 8.2 says, a proclamation made by the President under subsection 1 shall not be effective unless it contains a declaration that the President is satisfied that a public emergency has arisen as a result of the occurrence of any earthquake, hurricane, flood, fire, outbreak of pestilence, or of infectious disease or other calamity, whether similar to the foregoing or not. And it's a provision also for if there's war or something that you think is about to happen that would be detrimental to the country. So some questions for our consideration. Are measures which restrict movement, gatherings, church and business operations lawful in a COVID-19 environment? So we just read some provisions from our constitutions, and I think some of you should be able, therefore, to answer these questions based on what we have read. And we know that the threshold usually is that it has to be reasonably justifiable or reasonably required, depending on whether or not there's a public emergency declared. Some persons are of the view that the close down of churches, the shutdown of churches, and the restriction on religious activities were a breach of their right to freedom of conscience or freedom of religion. But we see that from our own constitutions, there is a limitation clause. And there is a balanced approach that we have to take, especially as Christians and as Seventh-day Adventists, because we have to be very careful what we put out to the world and to the governments when we are advocating our causes. So based on what we have read, we see that we have a right to freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. Were we told that we cannot worship and we cannot have services, for example, via Zoom and YouTube and any other social or other platforms, we were able to do so. But we see that in Barbados, in St. Lucia, in Jamaica, and in Grenada, there is actually a special provision, and the other countries can be covered by the other general provisions as well. There's a special provision in those countries' constitution for a situation where there's an infectious disease or an outbreak of pestilence. And therefore, it would be justifiable if you see that a virus is running rampant in a country and you need less contact in order to fight against it, in order to curb the spread, then the reasonable thing would that be the businesses and the institutions, education and otherwise, churches included, would therefore need to be a restriction on gatherings and different measures put in place to help curb the spread. So it's not that it's an unlawful abrogation right. It is an abrogation because you have the right and they're limiting it, but it's not unlawful in that context. Now, there are some people that argue otherwise, but it seems pretty clear to me. Are border closures, which have the effect of leaving citizens stranded, lawful in a COVID-19 context? Now, we always see you have to think about the reasonableness. It was quite heart-wrenching to hear of stories from Trinidadians, especially because I think it was really Trinidad, more so in this region, that we heard about so many stories. And one questions the reasonableness of it, especially it seemed at some point, because first of all, there were elections in August, I think it was, around that time last year, and it seemed unreasonable. You go ahead with elections and you relax certain protocols and certain restrictions, so it seemed unreasonable that you will leave citizens stranded instead of put measures in place where you can bring them home, having proper measures in place and proper facilities in place to have them quarantined for the period that is specified by the health authorities. It's not to say that border closures generally would be unlawful. We have to have a balanced approach to everything, especially if we are relaxing protocols, especially if even so, you are not even trying to put things in place that you can bring home persons who left thinking they're leaving, or they would have left before the border closed, expected to be away for 2 weeks or a month, and therefore financially able to maintain themselves for 2 weeks or a month or 6 weeks to 2 months, and therefore trying to refill medications and any knowledge of when they'll be back home and money and food and these basic needs. So it is a balancing out that the governments have to do. Can an employer require its employees to be vaccinated? Now, that is a very topical one, and we will touch on that. And then the fourth one is, can governments in the region lawfully institute a mandatory vaccination program? I know most of us are very concerned with these two last questions. So before I get to them, some possible categories of frontline workers, because we heard in the pandemic, new categories, it seems, of frontline workers, because generally we would know that doctors and nurses and persons working in the hospitals and EMTs and pharmacists have workers generally, police officers, fire service officers, etc. Those we know generally to be essential workers and frontline workers. But in this situation, we have added persons such as hospitality workers, the persons at the ports of entry, the cruise ship workers, airline and hotel employees, teachers, they added to that list as well, supermarket employees, because these persons would have been interfacing with the public when at a time, in some instances, when others were not interfacing with the public. So we had new categories introduced, and possibly these are some of the categories that employers or the governments will use if they roll out mandatory vaccination programs. And we know that in our region, they have been given these persons particularly doctors, nurses, and in some countries, teachers, etc., and the hospitality workers priority to receive the vaccines. So in the case of Barbados, and there are acts across the region as well that are similar to this, the Safety and Health at Work Act says at Section 6, subsection 5, it shall be the duty of every occupier to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, the health, safety, and welfare at work of all his employees. And that is very broad. Subsection 6 says, without prejudice to the generality of an occupier's duty under subsection 5, the matters to which that duty extends include, in particular, so far as is reasonably practicable, as regards any place of work, the maintenance of it in a condition that is safe and without risk to health. So you would have heard some persons saying that it is not, the question is, it is not unlawful for an employer to require its employees to be vaccinated. Now, let's take, for example, someone working at the hospitals, especially if you're working at the respiratory hospital in the case of St. Lucia, should be VH, or if you're working at the isolation center in Barbados. It would seem reasonable that you would ask your doctors and your nurses and the workers, I will at least offer them, you would speak to them. And these persons, some of them, or perhaps even most of them, are inclined to take it. They have learned about these things in school and they have taken other vaccines. So it would seem reasonable that you would ask them to take it, and you don't usually jump to require your workers to do certain things. It is usually the protocol and the usual process that you educate, you consult, you discuss, you ask, you request, you remind, and then it may come to a point where you think that it is necessary that you put it as either a prerequisite or that you require it for the employees that are already employed by you. So the example of a frontline worker, a doctor, nurse, etc., it may seem reasonable, especially if you think of the isolation centers, that you ask them, you are even go the step further and require them, if they don't accept that they should be vaccinated, to be vaccinated. No, remember, you always have to balance these things, especially if you're speaking about the government, with reasonableness. And the considerations that we have to take in consideration, or that the court will take in consideration if an action is brought, is the risk involved. And I think it's pretty obvious that there would be a pretty high risk involved, even if you try your best to wear a mask, etc. And you're interfacing with persons who are positive for COVID-19, who have the virus, the coronavirus. What you have to take also, I will assume the court will take into consideration also would be the effectiveness of the vaccine. And then persons would consider that, well, perhaps this vaccine will do me more harm than the other. So you do a balancing act. There is no real yes or no answer to this question. There is a limitation clause in the Constitution, and there are provisions provided here in the Safety and Health at Work Act, but you always have to go back to whether it is reasonably justifiable in a democratic society or reasonably required. But we can see how it would be reasonably justified at the very least if you are a frontline worker working at the isolation centers. Now, what about if you are a hospitality worker and the country has opened up its borders, tourists are coming back, and people are coming from places that have all types of variants, or you're at the ports of entry, or you're a bus operator, taxi operator, and therefore you are at an increased risk of contracting the virus. It may seem more reasonable to require such a worker to get the vaccine than it would seem to someone who works as an employee on a farm in St. Lucie on his own and probably may come into limited contact with his employer and doesn't really interface with others or persons coming into coming into the island or that are positive generally. So it may seem more reasonable for such persons. That is not to say that in order to reach I'm not sure if it's 65% or 70% of the country wants to reach the threshold for vaccinations, that the country cannot, because of the way in which the crisis is going, mandate that its citizens, where possible in terms of the person's health, to be vaccinated. So we should, and the government should take into consideration those persons who may have special health concerns. And you have employers who may say, okay, you are pregnant, all right, we will leave you out for now, or you have a heart issue, or you have issues with blood clotting, or we will leave you for now, because it is usually the courtesy to be able to balance and work around as far as possible. But at the end of the day, you have to provide an environment, a working environment that is safe for all of the employees, and maintain a working environment that is in a condition that is safe and without risk to health. So it's always a balancing act between one employee and the other employees, or the individual and the public health perspective. And at section 7, subsection 1, it says every occupier shall keep his workplace so that the safety of persons in the workplace is not likely to be endangered. Take such precautions as are reasonable in the circumstances, and ensure the safety of every person in the workplace. Section 9.1 says it shall be the duty of every employee to take reasonable care for the health and safety of himself and of other persons who may be affected by his acts or omissions at work. So employer mandated vaccinations and national mandatory vaccinations. So national mandatory vaccinations, the balancing act between the freedom of the individual, which we went through, and public health considerations. It must always look to what is reasonable, what approach is reasonable and proportionate to what we are dealing with, the situation at hand. So if we have one case in Ireland and there is no community spread, and we have that case isolated, and what we've been saying so far, I can't say I have the full understanding of the epidemiological links, etc., but I'm just trying to give an example. And we have that one case isolated. And so far, there seems to be a handle on it, although they could open the borders and then things change. It may not be reasonable or proportionate to say, okay, from tomorrow we're starting mandatory vaccinations. But the higher the risk, we can see how we can argue for the reasonableness and the proportionality of requiring vaccinations. But the usual process with the employer mandated vaccinations is that you consult with the employees and you consult with the union who operate on behalf of the employees, instead of just changing the terms and conditions of employment of employees unilaterally. Now, employers can justify the change by going back to the Safety and Health Act that we just quoted. Can there be a prerequisite for new employees? You do a good interview and they say, have you been vaccinated? And you say, no. Do you have anything against being vaccinated? And you said, well, I don't want to be vaccinated. And they say, well, we have a prerequisite for new employees that they must be vaccinated. What they work the issues are with their present employees, they say, well, going forward, we have a prerequisite for that. That is a little different because there's no contract between you. You can either take the job and say, okay, I'll just take the risk if you stay as a risk, or you can leave the job alone. So if the risk is higher and especially if the vaccine is very effective, then it is more likely that it be reasonably justifiable. Now we have news coming out of Antigua and Barbuda, which says that frontline government workers in Antigua and Barbuda will be required to either get the COVID-19 vaccine or be tested for the virus every 2 weeks at their expense. And we know how that could work because I've had the test a few times and it's not a comfortable test. And after a few times, you're hoping that they don't use the same nostril because not every time they use both. And not only that, they're not at your own expense because here in St. Lucia, I think it comes up to $267 or so, you see, to take the test. So let's say they did that and every 2 weeks you have to do that. So basically, sometimes you don't always introduce hard law. You don't always introduce an act, but you give them an option. You say, you get vaccinated or you take the test. So you're not telling them that it's mandatory to be vaccinated, but you're telling them that you have to do either or. And you're kind of wearing them down because nobody wants to go for a test every 2 weeks and certainly not at their own expense. And there are other things that people put in place, you will see in the same article, like restrictions, what you can do, if you can go to certain mass gatherings, if you're not vaccinated, if you can travel, and so on. So the Caribbean Media Corporation says the vaccination policy was communicated in a memorandum sent to government departments on Wednesday. The memo said testing for all unvaccinated staff members will begin 14 days following Monday, July 26. The new policy was confirmed by Minister of Information, Melford Nicholas, following Thursday's cabinet meeting. And it says now, additionally, as of August 1, only fully vaccinated persons will be allowed to patronize restaurants, bars, and other places of entertainment. And we know in the Caribbean persons, they love restaurants, they love bars, and they love other places of entertainment. So they're pretty much trying to push in the direction of vaccinations. Now, further considerations, because we have had so many schools of thought. There are persons saying linking the vaccine to the mark of the beast. Some saying I don't know if people are still saying that, but there were people saying that the vaccine is the mark of the beast, that you get a check when you receive the vaccine and different things, or they're saying that it's a stepping stone to the mark of the beast. And we must not be oblivious to the fact that there are some things that do go on behind the scenes. So the question is there a relationship between the vaccine and the mark of the beast? And before we get there, is the vaccine the test or is it the final test? Now we know from the Bible and from Spirit of Prophecy that there is one test which will divide the world, which will divide Christianity and the world, true Christianity and the world. There is a test between the true Sabbath and Sunday, the so-called holy day set up by governments across the world. So while there has been that school of thought that the COVID-19 vaccine is a mark of the beast or is somehow linked to it, or you receive a chip and then you can't make certain decisions and that kind of thing, and therefore should be avoided on that basis, it should be avoided at all costs. We know that it isn't the mark of the beast, because we know that based on the Bible, and we can go on Bible alone, but also Bible and Spirit of Prophecy, the mark of the beast is what will be set up as Sunday sacredness and calling Sunday the holy day and the day of rest and calling it the Sabbath, which it is not. So is the vaccine the test then, or the final test, which we all saw that is not the mark of the beast? And we know that the mark of the beast is the Sabbath question. We see that in Testimonies for the Church, volume 6, at page 352, we are told the Sabbath question is to be the issue in the great final conflict in which all the world will act apart. And the SDA Bible Commentary, volume 7, page 980 says, the substitution of the laws of men for the law of God, the exaltation by merely human authority or Sunday in place of the Bible Sabbath is the last act in the drama. So based on our knowledge and understanding of prophecy, we expect that at some point governments will pass laws which will encroach upon the right to freedom of conscience. Remember, we mentioned that earlier. In fact, persons are already contending that laws passed as part of government's efforts to mitigate the spread of the COVID-19 virus have violated their rights, including their right to freedom of religion. And some persons are of the view that mandatory vaccination would be a violation of the right to freedom of conscience, since they contend that to take the vaccine would be to allow harmful substance or substances to be introduced to their bodies, and that would be against the health message. Another contention is that persons have experienced adverse effects from the vaccine, and therefore for them to be compelled to take it would be to risk danger to their health and life. And I began by saying that let every man be persuaded in your own mind. So we must weigh these issues carefully. These issues should be considered not only from the legal perspective, but very acutely from the biblical and the scientific perspective, because science must come in here, because we need a proper understanding of whether how effective it is, what it actually does, and we heard Sister Cameron to mention it, and the effects short-term and especially long-term of the vaccine. So we need to understand these things so that we can have a balanced approach to these matters. Now, that's our present situation. The potential mandatory vaccination programs we expect to be tried severely leading up to and upon the passing of Sunday laws. So the question is, if we were to accept that things such as mandatory vaccinations are not unlawful, or if we go further and accept that such impositions are not breaches of the freedom of conscience, are we already and perhaps unwittingly putting ourselves in a position to align with the mark of the beast system? Or we can ask this question, if we accept these things, like the mandatory vaccinations, how then will we stand for principle in the face of Sunday laws which violate the freedom of conscience? I know some persons have these questions and concerns on their minds. We recognize that states can declare public emergencies and as provided for by the Constitution, curtail rights and freedoms as long as such infringements are reasonable in the circumstances, to put it that way, generally speaking. Before I go any further, though, I should also say that governments mandating that persons should not gather and churches should close, as I mentioned before, as part of their efforts to curb the spread of the virus. I have mentioned this. Should not be seen as a breach of the right to freedom of conscience. Persons were still free to worship on Zoom. Some people perhaps may have used Skype, Facebook Live, YouTube. So they were still able to worship as a result of many churches being as a result of the shutdown. So it wasn't a case where the government said, so Seventh-day Adventists, no more church on Sabbath for you, just allow the Sunday churches to go forward so we can help to curb the spread of the virus. The comparison is therefore between a virus that is seemingly out of control, and it is out of control, is an up and down situation, mutating and spreading like wildfire, and governments' attempts at controlling the spread, such efforts possibly including mandatory vaccinations, and that's on one hand, and nations and governments seeing this is in the future now. On the other hand, that everything is out of hand, out of control. There's crime and violence everywhere, all kind of pestilence and calamities of every kind, and therefore we need to get back to church. If the governments were to stop there and encourage everyone to go to church or the synagogue or the mosque, encourage on any day of the week, the governments will still not be in breach of the right to freedom of conscience. But we know that they will go further and say that not only is everyone encouraged to go back to church, but they must go back to church, and they must go back to church on a certain day, and that day will be recognized as sacred. Now, if the government simply say that no one must work on Sundays and must rest or participate in religious activities, but they still allow persons to continue to worship on Saturdays or whatever days of the week, we have counsel from Spirit of Prophecy that we should down our tools on Sunday, notwithstanding the financial blow it might give to our businesses, and we should do missionary work on Sundays. We can even use the time to study with others and distribute literature to warn about what is about to come, the same Sunday issue. But when the government seek to usurp our freedom of conscience and religion by mandating that all persons must rest and worship on Sunday, and that Sunday is the holy day, and therefore there should be no religious worship or activities on any other day, we must stand firm to principle, come what may. So there can be a difference we see, therefore, in what is obtaining now and what we're obtaining the different. Always goes back to what is a balanced approach, what is reasonably justifiable in a democratic society. So what would be the reasonably justifiable purpose for governments to make such a law, such as a Sunday law? To appease God's wrath, so to speak, and by so doing, put a handle on the societal ills and other problems? By whose authority will Sunday be chosen as a so-called holy day? Is it by the same God's authority whose wrath they're trying to appease, or is it by another person or another institution, so to speak, authority? We know that in any event, you cannot really control a person's conscience, a person's thoughts. Individuals or institutions may seek to mandate outward actions, but a person's conscience is between him and God, and that's whether or not he believes in God, actually. So requiring me to cease work at a church and attend church means nothing if my heart remains the same. So if we consider these things carefully, we see that there's a difference between what presently obtains and what could potentially obtain concerning mandatory vaccinations and what will obtain in the future concerning the passing of Sunday laws. I see a message saying I need to close, and I am closing. There are persons who say that they will go to jail if the choice is between the vaccine and jail. Now, every individual is accountable to God for himself or herself. If you think that you have a work to do in jail at this time, well, I don't know. But I end here, and I end by encouraging everyone to weigh all angles prayerfully and carefully. There is so much information being shared, whether factual or otherwise. So I urge all of us, and I include myself, that we be prayerful and careful, that we be no more children tossed to and fro and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the state of men, and cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sister Karaje, for a very exhaustive and good presentation. We've had 3 very good presentations. It is obvious that each presenter needed a lot of time. Now, Elder Leacock has kindly advised that at this point, he thinks we should open up for questions on what has gone before, because now our time is fast going, and he has self-sacrificingly allowed that we open up now for questions on what has gone before. And in any of those questions, he of course can make his input on any psychosocial component. So thank each presenter for the presentations, and Sister Kara J for the last one on legal technicalities. If I had time, I was going to pick her up on a statement she made to tease her father, but I can't do that now because of time. She said that she couldn't get into economic issues. Any so-called economists that wanted to do it could try. And I was going to invite someone who's so-called, but that's by the side. Okay, we open up now for questions on the presenters who have presented, to the presenters who have presented thus far, and questions in general. So the Zoom floor is open for questions at this time.
Yeah, just to make a clarification, Sister Karjay, I didn't say economic, I said insurance, because, the insurance policies and right. So that is what I meant.
Yo, I good. All right.
Any questions? If there are no questions, I can let Brother Leacock go on.
I have a question, Brother Doc.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is to Carol J. The law says that.
Among Democrats that they
Alicia, close your mic, please. Yeah, yes, Carol J. The laws, the way how the Constitution is written, it is really for the lawyers, but this Constitution is for citizens. So the same way how government would indicate that it is mandatory for vaccinations. Can we get the law to also now guarantee those persons who are taking the vaccine and something goes wrong for the same state to assume all the liability and make sure that the wrong has been righted? I am in several fora, and we are told that the vaccine does not stop you catching the virus. It does not stop you spreading the virus. So given that, I am not sure that we are mitigating the risks. So I am asking if the citizens should not be calling on the law or the constitutions to be even more balanced by assuming if you mandate that I do this thing and something goes wrong, you are going now to restore me how it was. So cover all of my hotel bills, pay my rent since I cannot work, and that type of thing. That is a balanced constitution. Thanks.
Okay, I won't pick up too much on the statement you made about not mitigating the risk. And it was Sister Karamita mentioned it briefly about, you may get it after being vaccinated, but the seriousness of the virus will be mitigated and perhaps death, etc. But anyway, I guess I see her hand up and I suppose she will pick up on that. Usually, actually, what happens is that quite the opposite happens. They cover the state and they cover even the persons bringing up the vaccines. And you will see sometimes a covering for the chief medical officer and those persons who implement certain policies that they are to be covered. They are not supposed to be brought. Any action is not supposed to be brought against them if something goes wrong. So in St. Lucia, for example, it wasn't even with vaccinations. It was about the different measures being put in place, the limitations and the restrictions. And the legislation was covering the CMO. So if anybody sought to bring an action, she was covered from any action against her. So that question about if the Constitution will provide for such, it is quite unlikely that it will do that. you will probably see such a floodgate of claims coming up. I don't see it going in that direction. It wouldn't be the Constitution, though it would be some other legislation, but I don't see it going in that direction.
Yeah, you're so correct. Just to add, Brother Odo, you were correct in saying that getting the vaccine does not stop you from getting COVID. But what the vaccine does, it still mitigates. It prevents you from getting severely ill and it prevents you from dying. So the vaccine does have mitigating aspects to it, but you can get COVID and you can still spread it, yes. And a smaller percentage of persons will get. In other words, if 200 persons take the vaccine, chances are that 10 of them might get infected rather than the 200 that don't take. All right. So as the vaccine, as the scientists stipulated, most of the vaccines are 85% efficacious, which means that there's a 15% who will not really get the antibodies and get the protection. So that is known upfront. But barring that, persons can still become infected even if they have the vaccine, but it reduces the severity of the illness. So that is what is stated. So that is a risk and that is a chance that persons should take in getting the vaccine. Prevent is a matter of life or death. It's just like the common cold. You will get the common cold, but you might not necessarily die from it. All right. So it's the same thing with the vaccine, especially with these variants. You don't want to die. So you want to preserve life. So that's the reason for taking the vaccine.
Doc, if you will permit me one last thing, I would just like to place on record, notwithstanding my question, I am fully vaccinated. So I am not encouraging people not to take vaccines, but this here is a forum that we discuss and put everything on the table. And it is also stressing is that it is also a fact that even I am told now by Carf and the others that we work with, that notwithstanding you get the vaccine, you can still catch the virus and you can still spread it and that type of thing. But believers.
All right, thank you. I see some other things there, but let me just briefly say something to put things in perspective that people seem to forget. Nowadays, and it has been so for a long time, if you apply to a university in any part of the world or Barbados Community College here to do any health science, nursing, medicine, physiotherapy, med lab, you have to be immunized against hepatitis B or you will not be admitted to do the course. It has been so for decades. If you want to go to Guyana, going to the interior, you have to be immunized against yellow fever. Otherwise, you can't go, and that's you. I'm going to know a man that make a big set of noise. I going down to the interior, so lift 300 pounds, a big weightlifter, and then taking medication for malaria. He went to the interior, and a mosquito bite him in the hollow for his mother. They bring him out in a box. Foolhardiness. So when I was going to university, which is several decades ago, hepatitis B was not a big thing, and there was no vaccine. I went to Jamaica, I had to get polio vaccine. I was very glad, because when I went to Jamaica and saw the amount of polio in Jamaica, if I hadn't gotten the polio vaccine in 1968, when I was leaving for university, I would have gone down there and caught it. But by now, hepatitis B is a big thing, and they have a vaccine. So if you go to any medical school, you have to get hepatitis B vaccine to protect yourself and the patients, and it is compulsory. Not compulsory for you to get it. If you don't get it, you can't go to the medical school. That's been so for years, and I haven't heard people making any noise about it. So I am just putting things in perspective as how people holler as if all of a sudden some degree of compulsion for public health. One other point, if you get a tetanus vaccine, listen to me carefully, it lasts for 10 years, but if you get a tetanus vaccine and you get a nail puncture in cow dung, the tetanus germs will still go into your foot, but when they produce the toxin that would normally kill the person who is not vaccinated, it won't kill you who is vaccinated. So the tetanus vaccine doesn't prevent the tetanus germ from infecting you, but it prevents you from dying from the tetanus. So all along, vaccines have had various mechanisms of approach. And one last thing biblically, talking about freedom, in the day, I just looked, while Sister Cara J was speaking, I was back in Leviticus 13, 12, 13, and 14, public health in the 8 days of Israel. God told Moses, if you see a bump on the skin and it turns red and the hair turns white, the priest is to diagnose leprosy. And the man must come back in 7 days. In those 7 days, he is not to go in the congregation. He's not to go back home. If in 7 days it heals, it was a temporary infection. His own immunity got over it. If in 7 days it is worse, 7 more days unclean. And if you check again and it isn't cured, out of the tent, out of the congregation, he's declared unclean until either he dies or is cured. So God had public health measures in Israel to protect against infectious disease. And that wasn't an interference with the man's liberty of conscience in worship. It was to protect the congregation. The man could still, wherever he was, read his own Torah and worship his own God, but he wasn't to put the rest of the congregation at risk for leprosy. So public health laws for health are not interferences with liberty of conscience. Even if you think that you can imagine there may be a stepping stone in that direction, they are not yet an interference of freedom of worship. I throw that out, continue your discussion. Brother Saul, go ahead. On you, Brother Saul, go ahead.
This is the challenge I have when people question me. The problem is, and I've heard some people say that, the problem is when some people tie their health to their religion. Some people's health, they're tied to their religion. And they cite the example of the 3 Hebrew boys when they were asked or told that they have to eat meat offered to idols. The problem was not the meat. They could have eaten the meat, but the meats were offered to idols. And they refused to eat it on threat of death. That's the nature of it. In some places, I understand some people are exempting Rastafarians. I don't know why, but I heard that one. The question is, what advice would you tell to give a person like that when they tie their health to their religion?
Well, that is a good question. I would say this. All along we've been coming along, the only people you've been hearing tying health to the religion are essentially Seventh Adventists. We have a health message and so on. All of a sudden, people who don't care anything really about health, who drink and smoke, eat what they like, all of a sudden now talking about these things, when in truth and in fact, they never had any health in their conscience linked to any religion. They now bring out these red herrings to justify a position that is illogical.
Because their argument is what they're putting into their bodies and that they should have a choice as to what they eat, what they drink, what they put into their bodies. And if they feel that it's detrimental, they're abstaining. And that's their strong conviction on that.
Okay, no problem. These are the same people who, when you tell not to eat certain things, tell you going to die anyhow. Don't mind them foolish Adventists. But I only show how people reason when they want to reason.
Yeah, fair enough. It's really a delicate matter, especially when it comes to conscience and government, especially coming from government, you know.
I see next was
Peter.
Brother Peter Ken, then Simon Peter, then Elder W.A. Graves, then V20.
All right.
No, I don't want to disturb the train because I was dealing with something completely different. I was dealing with the insurance.
Go ahead. Vaccination isn't the subject for this evening, you know. It is natural disasters.
Okay, in relation to insurance, generally, insurance covers your property and they do not include a clause for upgrading. Let's say, for instance, you have a flat roof and the roof is blown off. They will give a cost based on a replacement cost of a roof, but they would not give a cost for an improvement to the roof to the standard of the building code. They would only do that if the building code is a matter of law. If it is not a matter of law, then all they would give you is the replacement cost based upon the value of replacing the roof, not the value of improving the roof to the standard of the building regulations that is necessary. So there's a uniform building code in the Caribbean. It is not accepted or legislated in a lot of territories. And in Barbados, it's not legislated. So in speaking with the insurance agent and dealing with the matter, he was very clear. We will replace the roof based upon the value, the proportionate value that is related to the roof replacement. But in terms of upgrading the roof to the standard that is necessary to withstand hurricane force winds, your insurance does not cover that upgrade and the value of the upgrade. And therefore, also too, whenever there's an insurance, whenever you have insurance for your property, I think about 2% of the value of the house is the deductible. So the first thing they do when your property is damaged is that they deduct the deductible. So for instance, there are people who are complaining that their cost goes up to about $10,000. The deductible is $8,000, so they're only getting $2,000 to do the work for their roof. And that's how the insurance companies are functioning. So they deduct the deductible first, and then whatever is after that is applicable to the repair of the roof. The next advice I would give is that you ought to ensure that you value your property on a yearly basis and ensure that is accepted by the insurance company. The insurance company can provide you with a valuator to value your property. If you don't do it probably on every 2 years or so, what will happen is that your building will be on the value. They will tell you that it's on the value, and therefore you will not be able to get the sort of monetary replacement costs finance as a result of any damage for hurricanes to your property. So I just to your properties. So I just wanted to mention that because people sometimes live in a house for 30 years and pay the same insurance for 30 years. When the insurance come and value the property, when it's damaged, you say, well, your property is greatly undervalued, and therefore we take the 2%, and to replace it will cost a lot more, but you need to be able to have your properties valued properly and therefore allow the insurance then to approve that valuation so that you will ensure that any damages that you will at least get some significant costs, some significant funds to deal with your damages. That's just a comment.
All right, thank you. I think next was Simon Peter.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, although I think you could speak a little bit louder.
Okay. I know this evening you're talking about natural disasters, but since you all divert into the vaccine, I personally am not anti-vax, right? But I am anti-vax against that COVID vaccine. Why? Because the same tactics that they are using for this COVID vax and encroaching on people's freedom, it is the same tactics that they're going to use when the mark of the beast crisis comes. And anybody who wants to take the vaccine, I'm not against them taking it, but I won't advise anybody to encourage people to take it. You know, because if anything happens, they can blame you for telling them to take this vaccine.
But Simon Peter,
yes.
Would you encourage people to get a vaccine against hepatitis B or tetanus?
Dr. Douglin, these vaccines were there for years and we had no problem with them. But
okay,
from the time that COVID, okay, hold on, from the time that this COVID vaccine comes,
listen a minute.
Everybody have a problem with this COVID vaccine.
That is not true.
That is not true? No,
that's not true. Listen carefully. When something starts, there is always going to be a difficulty. Listen to some history, because I am very firm when it comes to a lot of people talking about they don't know when. By the way, a suggestion has come that we continue tomorrow night. Let Elder Leacock present his presentation, and we
I feel
continue
he
the
should have.
discussion tomorrow.
I feel he should have.
Is that okay with everybody?
But let me finish my contribution.
Yes.
1 minute. I'm just asking the congregation if they want to continue. I'm not stopping, you know. I'm just asking if you want to continue tomorrow whenever we finish.
Sure.
Tomorrow at 6.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Okay. Continue, Simon Peter.
I am saying we had this vaccine on hepatitis B, and I have taken them. But you see, when technology was not available in the past, now that we have technology available, there is no secret of what the people are doing and what they are planning to do. These things were kept in secret, but now they have the internet and everything is exposed. So as you go against something, they are saying that you are what? You know, that you are anti this and anti that and you're extremist. That is not true. They are mixing lies with the truth. And that is what people are doing out there. The same people are going to tell you that these things are good. Who can we trust in this world now? Scientists, government, politicians, even people you go to church with? You can't trust nobody. So how could anybody tell me that this thing is good? And nobody knows the long-term effect of taking it. And many people have died from it. You know, when things start to happen to people, and then they will say, oh Lord, I'm sorry I did this and that. We don't want to hear about people telling you sorry in the long term.
Brother Simon, I need to comment on that. Yes, I need to comment on that. Really and truly, I don't know where you get these deaths from, but there are a number of different vaccines. And as Brother Douglin was about to allude to, when the other vaccines first started, there were a lot of persons against them because they didn't understand them either. But when they saw that they were actually saving lives, then persons started to understand them over time and started to use them. But this more recent vaccine, people saying is the Chinese vaccine. We ain't want nothing to do with it. But when you look at it, the Sinopharm, this is the same type of mechanism of the childhood vaccines that we used to give the children, the attenuated strain. So if you're saying to me, okay, I don't want the Pfizer or I don't want the Moderna because those are messenger RNA and I don't like that mechanism, then there are other vaccines that you can use like the Sinopharm, which is similar to the childhood vaccines when there is an attenuated strain, which is the killed weakened virus. All right. So it's just a matter of understanding, but persons, before they start to understand anything, they just came out to say, no, not me. But I can understand because there was actually one brother and he said to me, I am not using any messenger RNA. I am not using any Pfizer or Moderna. I'm not using AstraZeneca. But the minute the Sinopharm came on board, he's a pharmacist. He said to me, yes, I went and had my jab yesterday. And I said, but I thought you were anti-vaccine. He said, no, I'm not anti-vaccine. I am anti those mechanisms. But now I find one that I am willing to go with. So let's be careful of that. Rather than throwing out everything, try to understand which one we really want to use and which one we don't want to use.
I have never seen such a global, I mean, like everybody's coming together on this vaccine. The whole world, you know, they are cooperating. Everybody's cooperating. Nobody's going against it. So everybody's cooperating. And once you see everybody's cooperating on something, there is a problem. There is a problem with this thing. This thing can't be right.
All right, Elder W.A. Greaves, go ahead.
Yes, just two points to make, really. And you know, the apostle referring to somebody talking about conscience and idol and Daniel and those, but the apostle Paul in Romans 10 made some interesting point that if 1 Corinthians 10, that the things that Gentiles offer, they offer to devils and not to God. And he said, but idol is nothing. So for East, either idol It's absolutely nothing because it's nothing. But I wouldn't do it for the conscience of a weak brother. And here was Paul, very liberated man of God. I don't believe that Daniel and those were otherwise persuaded as well. But my major point has to do with this vaccine issue. You know, what I smile at often is this. People talk about, I'm putting that in my body that will do this or that, which is good. But how many of them put things in their mind that will stop them from seeing the kingdom of God? You know, I am always amazed that we look more at peripheral issues than the central issues. How many of us allow things to come in our mind? As a matter of fact, they'll be more detrimental to our salvation, health, use that expression, than taking a vaccine shot. And therefore, I think that if we would step back and realize what are the important issues in life that we might be being right now hijacked by the enemy to be looking at something, though real, not central to our eternal salvation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, we are going to close shortly and continue tomorrow evening at 6. You're all invited back, but Elder Leacock will make his presentation, and then we'll open up for the discussion on all 4 areas as usual. I was saying earlier, though, that when Edward Jenner noticed that people who had cowpox didn't get killed with smallpox and took cowpox juice and scraped it in people's arm, that was the start of modern vaccination, and people gathered and nearly stoned him when it was found out that millions of lives were saved by smallpox vaccine. Sister White herself took the smallpox vaccine before she left for Europe in the 1800s. So when things are new and there's usually ignorance and superstition and lies, and people accept lies as truth because they read a lot of fancy stuff and keep a lot of noise. And then when things settle down and the facts come out, they see that when you're looking at biological systems, we human beings can't do anything perfect in a sinful fallen world, but we have to look at mitigating and reducing risk. So if you can save 100 million lives with a vaccine and it has a side effect to kill 50 people, does that compare with losing millions of people with the actual disease? And this is what we have to look at, because we live in an imperfect world and there are no perfect systems we have, but God gives us wisdom and understanding to do our best to reduce morbidity and mortality, to allow probation until, of course, the kingdom comes when there'll be no more sickness or disease. All right, so I see hands up, but I just said we're going to wrap up. I see Elder Greaves, your hand is still up. And I see Elder Newton. Newton?
Yes, sir.
Good.
Yes, I observed this afternoon that the presenters were each given 15 minutes.
Yes.
Sister Caramita went for about 3:15s.
Yes.
Rush to finish.
Yes.
Austin went well over 15, 2 or 3 15s. Carajia with I think the legal aspect of it touches everybody, and most people probably want further discussion on that. She said that she wouldn't go as long as the rest. Well, she rushed to finish. And you were talking about starting at 6 tomorrow, which, and if Brother Saul rushes to finish, you know, he might take 45 minutes and then there's not much time left. So I suggest that with the interest shown, my initial suggestion in the chat there is to start at 4. But if you want me to compromise, I would say 4:30 or 5, but certainly not 6.
Agreed. Maybe 5.
you have to put a time for closing in that case, Brother Newton, if you start 5, 6, 4, whatever.
From 5 to 7.
Unmute Dr. Douglin. Unmute Dr. Douglin.
Brother Peter, stop the recording, please.